Running back through an area after you die to a boss has been a staple throughout the Souls series, but its purpose is highly debated by the community to this day. The two arguments go something like,
"This is a huge waste of time. Why would anyone want to do this?"
and
"I enjoy pain."
Clearly they've evolved this aspect in the Souls games over time, so I wanted to take a look at the history of boss runbacks throughout all the Souls games and explore how they changed and why, as well as how many controllers I went through while attempting them. I've wanted to talk about this for a while, and I've only seen one video about this topic, and it was by JK Leeds, so shout out to him. But for now, let's start at the beginning. Demon's Souls was the first installment of the Souls series back in 2009 with a unique formula that shocked gamers across the world and changed the industry forever. With Demon's Souls being one of the last Souls games I played due to it being a PS3 exclusive until the remake in 2020, I found the bosses to be pretty easy, making the runbacks to each boss almost irrelevant. That is, until I played it through again on New Game Plus, only to realize how brutal the boss runs are in this game. Each area only has one bonfire, meaning your run back to the boss is the entire level. Every time. But this is where they adapted by creating shortcuts, you know, those pesky doors that seem to only open from one side, or the lift that can't be activated even though there's a lever right in front of it. Shortcuts were an awesome addition to the Souls formula because they encourage exploration and, most importantly, save you some sanity when running back to the boss. But don't worry, most of them are still insanely difficult for no reason. The old Heroes boss run comes to mind here, as it had me using every cheese tactic possible on the old hero just to avoid doing this dreadful run again. It has rolling skellies that can outrun you, laser ghost alien things that block your way on the stairs, and reapers that hide in super inconvenient places. Another one that drove me crazy was False King Alon. I thought I would need a haircut by the time this elevator was done moving, but it turned out fine because I was just 55 and balding instead. Why they decided to make this take so long, I don't know. It feels really intense and dramatic the first time you take it, but I feel like they should have put another bonfire somewhere at the top. And I wish I could say they sped up the elevators in the future, but unfortunately we'll get to that later. I will say though, of all the Souls games, the boss runs in Demon's Souls make the most sense besides maybe Dark Souls 1, so at least I can appreciate that. But runs like Flame Lurkers, even with the shortcut, are just super tedious for no reason and feel like a waste of time. But that was just the first entry in the series, and I admire the consistency they kept, so let's talk about Dark Souls. Also, you should definitely cop one of these shirts, link in the pinned comment, I hand make them myself, I love you. As much as I'd love to whine about how long it takes to run everywhere in this game, I have to step back and remember my first playthrough. It was incredible. The level design in this game is unmatched, and while some of the boss runbacks make me want to order a new Xbox, wait 2 days by the door for Amazon to ship it, check the tracking number to make sure they didn't mess up my order, realize I accidentally bought an Xbox One X and not the Series X, scramble to return my order and get the one I actually wanted, finally get it at the door as I smash my current Xbox. Wait, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, basically while some of the boss runs make me want to smash my Xbox with a sledgehammer, it's hard for me to get too upset because they feel very intentional. I didn't mind too many of these runbacks in my first playthrough because I was still exploring and finding new shortcuts along the way. Also because I didn't realize you could travel halfway through the game. Since the interconnectivity and exploration of Dark Souls is the strongest point of the game, it makes sense that some of the runbacks can be tedious. Running around and stumbling upon a boss like the Taurus Demon makes for a really memorable moment that would likely have had less of an impact if you found a checkpoint right outside the door. But then there are bosses like Pinwheel where you have to just kidding, you're never gonna have to do that run again. But then there are bosses like Nito where you have to run through the second half of the Tomb of Giants, which was bad enough already. These kinds of runs are where things get complicated because after Dark Souls strays a bit from the interconnectivity, it feels like they may have had more of an excuse to add some convenient checkpoints. Even with Quelaag though, there's just no reason they couldn't have added another bonfire outside the fog wall instead of making us run through poison every time. It just feels like unnecessary effort for something you already completed that serves no purpose forcing you to do it over and over. I'm not gonna go kill every enemy again, so it's not making me any better anyway. And don't even get me started on the Bed of Chaos. Overall though, it seems like the first two games, while slow at times, still had a lot of intention with their design and stuck to that philosophy throughout the experience, which justified a lot of the inconvenience for me. And that brings us to Dark Souls 2. Oh boy. This is where things got extreme, aiming to frustrate the player more than anything else with crazy enemies and obstacles, all just to go get one shot by the boss. The boss runs in Dark Souls 2 are more challenging than tedious, so at least you won't be bored. You might lose a bit of sanity though. Dark Souls 2 is without a doubt the game with the worst boss runs. I remember I first noticed how bad they were when I had my first encounter with the Smelter Demon. I went through this so many times I ended up despawning all the enemies in the area just so I could get through, which is 15 times by the way. It's not not that this run was necessarily difficult, which it definitely is, it's more just the fact that you don't get any invincibility frames when traversing the fog until the end, meaning the enemies can hit you out of it. This adds so much unnecessary stress to these runs because not only do you have to make it past dozens of spammed enemies on your way to the boss, you also have to make sure they're far enough away for you to get into the fog gate. There is absolutely no need for this many enemies to be in an area to begin with, much less on your way to a boss. And honestly, it gets so ridiculous later in the game, I couldn't help but set my controller down and laugh and cry. Sir Alone's boss run is pretty brutal as well, with how much is going on and how quick the enemies are, and not to mention he's a pretty tough boss. The blue smelter demon is one of the runs that almost broke me because even the shortcut is a pain to go through. If you take the normal route, your movement will be slowed while archers shoot at you and random enemies stuffed into a hallway lunge at you. I could go on forever here, but we all know what the holy grail is here, the frigid outskirts. This area has been talked about a billion times already, so I won't regurgitate what everyone else has said, but this one was just straight up unreasonable. Even with a guide, this run probably took me 50 plus tries and the boss wasn't even good. And I'm not even including attempts with the boss. This run took me 50 tries to just get to the boss. The interesting thing about Dark Souls 2 is, unlike the other games, these boss runs feel very intentional, like they crafted each run on purpose. The blue smelter demon's boss run looked like it was very thought out, which means they really just wanted to screw with us. Personally, I don't mind a bit of running if it makes sense within the game, but I think a really difficult boss run can take away from the quality of the boss itself because you get so worried about getting through the run again. It tempts me to cheese my way through or use any tactics possible just to get the boss over with. I understand wanting to have bonfires be a rare moment of relief within the world, but that's why shortcuts were introduced, so I don't really know why these weren't utilized more for convenience. So that's basically the approach Dark Souls 2 took. I think the main reason these were received so poorly is because they felt like they lacked a purpose within the game. But while Dark Souls 2 was finishing up, Miyazaki was working on something big. His magnum opus, Bloodborne. This one is interesting because not many people talk about the boss runs in this game, but I think it has some of the longest, but its reasons may be justified. Also, if you like these videos, please subscribe. One big change Bloodborne made to the Souls formula is the introduction of lamps as opposed to bonfires. Since lamps only serve as a method of traveling back to the hunter's dream, it makes sense that they'd have more strategic placements, meaning less of them in the world. Since lamps serve a different purpose in Bloodborne, it's easy to see why some of the boss runs in this game tend to run a little bit long. They did utilize shortcuts very well in this game, but still made the same mistakes as the previous titles by leaving large runbacks to the bosses anyway. The reason for this is because most of the time you're expected to traverse a level and find the shortcut when you finish that section. Then you finish the second half before facing the boss of that level. I would have loved to see these games incorporate third checkpoints for each level with hidden bonfires right next to the boss like Dark Souls 2 did in the Black Gulch. But since Bloodborne put more emphasis on the lamps being a rare checkpoint that holds more value, it makes sense for them to add shortcuts as opposed to resting points. A resting point would have been really nice though. The scenario I was imagining here was the run to Martyr Lugarius. There's one section of the level that leads you to the shortcut, then you have to run past tons of screaming witches and gargoyles to reach the boss. This run isn't hard by any means, but it takes up so much unnecessary time even with the shortcut that only gets more frustrating when you realize it's one of Bloodborne's more challenging bosses. The Shadows of Yharnam are another popular example of this, being one of the longest and most terrifying boss runs in the series, with the boss's difficulty making it even worse. Bosses like the Witches of Hemwick don't have great boss runs either, but the boss itself is easy enough to where no one really cares. These runs are made much more difficult in Bloodborne due to a lack of shields, which is my personal go-to if I need to run through an area. Can't wait to see the comments I get for that one. Needing to farm for heals and bullets in the early game can make this process stressful as well, but some of the runs like Father Gascoigne feel intentional to get you more vials and bullets, which I think is interesting. If they're gonna make us farm, at least let us do it on the way to the boss. Bloodborne definitely didn't seem to prioritize convenience in any way in this game, but I think they can get away with some of the longer runs due to the carefully crafted world building. And that leads us to Dark Souls 3. This game had a bonfire every 10 seconds, so the boss runs in this one really pissed me off. None of them were necessarily hard, they just had a lot of running for no particular reason. I will say you could tell they tried to make it a little bit easier on us by adding more checkpoints and plenty of shortcuts to cut down on the time, but that's where the problem was. Since it drew a lot from the first Dark Souls game, you can tell it lacked a little bit of direction and identity that the other games had. It felt a bit inconsistent with certain mechanics, especially with aspects such as convenience, because they seemed unsure of whether to evolve to a newer style of gameplay or stick to their old formula. This all resulted in tons of bonfires in certain areas that I think could have been utilized better. For instance, the run to the Twin Princes is incredibly long even with the shortcut, and the beginning of the run has 2 checkpoints right next to each other. And don't even get me started on the elevator. You'd think after 7 years of development they'd throw us a bone and speed it up a bit. Having a bonfire after each boss also explains why they felt like it was unnecessary to put one right outside the fog wall, but they could have easily just taken these out for the majority of the bosses. For example, you're probably never going to use the Crystal Sage bonfire because you get one pretty much 10 seconds later. While I don't think this boss run was too bad in the first place, it feels like they could have chosen a more useful location. The one thing Dark Souls 3 did change that was nice was making more convenient checkpoints for the really difficult bosses. The Nameless King, Soul of Cinder, Freed, Gale, all these bosses had pretty short runs, which showed that they were starting to focus more on boss quality and emphasizing the players learning their movesets as opposed to spending 5 minutes running back there again. None of the runs are too bad in this game, they just had some longer ones that felt pointless, especially with how many checkpoints they already had in the first place. Certain ones like the Abyss Watchers and Aldridge made more sense to me, but others such as the Twin Princes and the Crystal Sage just felt unnecessary. Then we reach Sekiro. This one is different enough to where I don't think it's very relevant here, but I do think it's important to mention just to show how FromSoft was evolving at the time. It's clear that they took a lot of the inconvenient aspects of the Souls formula out of Sekiro, and aside from the main reason being it's simply a different style of game, it's also because their focus shifted. As we saw in Dark Souls 3, you could see they began changing how they went about difficulty for the player, especially after Dark Souls 2's approach. Sekiro focused heavily on deflecting by learning boss movesets in a similar way to Dark Souls 3. They got much more confident in their boss and enemy design that they felt like they could take away some of the aspects that made their games challenging in the past and introduce a method that's more enjoyable. I would rather try a boss 100 times learning their moveset than try a boss 10 times that took the same amount of time just because of the run back. Learning a boss is fun, learning a run is not. And it's a complicated question, but I think most people can agree that most boss runs are simply a waste of time. Not everyone has 10 hours a day to play games, especially as we get older. Our time is precious, and it's great to see FromSoft respect that as they evolve. But there's one more game that wrapped up the boss run concept for good. Well, I hope so. Elden Ring did what everyone thought they would be too scared to do. They took away essentially every inconvenience a player could have in order to maximize time just playing the game. I think they did this perfectly, and while I was skeptical when I heard about additions such as the Stakes of Marika when the game was first shown, they ended up being an incredible solution to the inconvenience of boss runs. Especially with Elden Ring being an open world game, making us run all the way back to a boss was just unrealistic. Even though with Torrent it wouldn't have been that bad anyway. I think most people are happy with the changes they made and realized boss runs aren't necessary if the bosses themselves are still a challenge. I attempted the Draconic Tree Sentinel over 50 times in my first playthrough when I was way too underleveled for it, and there's no way I would have kept going if there wasn't a Stake of Marika there. But not all the bosses were this convenient. Toward the second half of the game, Torrent basically became unusable for the rest of the experience, which got kind of annoying after being used to having it the whole game. Some of the runs like Malekith and Dragonlord Placidusex ran a little bit long, and while I can't complain too much here, I'm just surprised they kept these little inconveniences for some of the harder bosses. But regardless of that, I do think the way they cut back a lot of the boss runs in this game made it much more enjoyable to me because I was willing to try over and over again instead of rage quitting. Having the freedom to leave whenever I wanted definitely helped this aspect as well, but overall I think Elden Ring proved that we don't need crazy long boss runbacks in order to be challenged. Also, if one more person tells me to do an outro, I'm gonna